Silas Ashford was the kind of man who could silence a room just by walking into it. His name alone made powerful men across the East Coast look over their shoulders. But inside his own mansion, the silence was different. It came from a 5-year-old girl who had never once heard her father's voice. His only daughter, Rosalie, was deaf since birth, and she cried every single day. Not loudly, not with screams, just silent tears rolling down her cheeks as if someone inside her were slowly turning on a faucet. No doctor could explain why. No specialist could make it stop. No amount of money could buy the answer. Silas Ashford could bring an entire empire to its knees, but he could not stop his own daughter from crying. Until one day, a 4-year-old boy walked into his house with nothing but a piece of chalk in his hand and saw what every expert had missed. If this story moves you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about strength. The Ashford family's mansion sat deep inside a sprawling estate in suburban Connecticut, enclosed by iron fencing that rose higher than a grown man's head, and by rows of hedges trimmed so precisely they looked less like landscaping and more like soldiers posted on guard. Inside, everything was built to announce power, from thick granite walls to gleaming oak floors, from paintings whose price tags could equal an ordinary home to crystal chandeliers suspended beneath ceilings that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. But none of that luxury meant anything to the 5-year-old girl curled beside the largest window on the second floor. Rosalie Ashford had only one favorite place in that enormous house, not the playroom overflowing with toys any child might dream of, not the garden with its fountain and custom-built swing. It was the narrow ledge by the second-floor sitting room window, where she could press her forehead and both small hands against the cold glass and look down at the wide courtyard below. From there, she could see everything. Sleek black SUVs passing through the heavy iron gate. Men in dark suits walking their patrol along the stone path. Now and then someone opened the gate, and the iron swung shut again with a hard, final slam that seemed to echo across the entire property. Every time it happened, Rosalie's body reacted before tears even had a chance to fall. Her shoulders lifted, her back curved inward, the hands on the glass tightened into tiny fists, and then she trembled. Not the trembling of cold, the trembling of a small creature trying to make itself smaller still, as if shrinking enough could make something stop seeing her, stop finding her. Then the tears came, quietly, without sound. They simply traced her cheeks and dropped onto the expensive dress she had never once cared about. The strangest thing, the thing no one truly paused long enough to think about, was Rosalie's hands. In between bouts of crying, she would often raise both hands and clamp them tightly over her ears, pressing hard, as if she were trying to block something from pouring in. In any other child, that gesture would have seemed completely ordinary. But Rosalie couldn't hear. She'd been deaf since birth. So what was she trying to shut out? Mrs. Pemberton, the current nanny and the one who'd lasted the longest, had seen that gesture dozens of times. She was a woman of 55, silver hair pinned neatly back, eyes tired but patient. When one of the younger aides asked about Rosalie covering her ears, Mrs. Pemberton only made a small dismissive motion. "It's just a habit. Children do that." The answer was accepted without another thought, the way people accept that when it rains the ground gets wet. No one asked why. No one considered that behind that seemingly meaningless action might be the answer to everything. Daytime was hard, but nighttime was when Rosalie's pain showed itself most clearly. Nearly every other night, sometimes night after night without a break, she woke in the dark. She didn't scream. She didn't call for anyone, because she didn't know what screaming was, and she had no one to call with her voice. She only sat straight up in a bed far larger than her small body, clutched a pillow tight against her chest, and began to rock, back and forth, slow, steady, like a sorrowful rhythm only she could sense. Mrs. Pemberton, asleep in the room next door, usually realized from the faint creak of the bed. She would come in, sit on the edge, gather the child into her arms, and smooth her hair. Rosalie would lean into her, still holding the pillow, her head resting against the nanny's chest. But her body never fully let go. Her shoulders stayed rigid, her breathing stayed broken, as if Mrs. Pemberton's embrace could only reach the outer layer, while the place Rosalie truly needed comfort remained much deeper, somewhere no human arms could ever reach. And so it went, night after night, the same as the night before. She would rock until exhaustion took her, then fall asleep in her nanny's arms. In the morning she woke again, walked back to the window, pressed her hands to the glass, and cried when something no one else could see seemed to invade her small body. A deaf child couldn't hear the gate slam shut, the engine turning over, the heavy footsteps of the security team. So why did Rosalie cry every time those things happened? And why did she cover ears that had never heard any sound at all? Silas did what he always did when he ran into a problem. He threw money at it. Within 2 weeks of Mrs. Pemberton reporting that Rosalie's condition hadn't improved at all, the Ashford mansion turned into an unofficial clinic. Dr. Langford arrived first, the most renowned audiology specialist in the Northeast, a man with salt and pepper hair and gold-rimmed glasses. He flew in from Boston on a private plane Silas had sent to fetch him. He sat in the sitting room, opened a thick file case, and explained in a steady voice that Rosalie was experiencing difficulty adjusting to an environment with limited auditory input. He used long, complicated phrases, sketched charts on paper, pointed to curves Silas didn't understand and didn't want to understand. When Silas asked bluntly, "So why does she cry?" Dr. Langford adjusted his glasses and said more observation time was needed. After Dr. Langford came a child psychologist from New York, a young woman with a gentle voice and a professional smile that never left her lips. She sat on Rosalie's bedroom floor for 3 afternoons, trying to engage the child with toys, with pictures, with simple gestures. Rosalie didn't respond. She sat by the window, eyes fixed on the courtyard, and when Harris's black SUV rolled past, her body curled inward and the tears began to fall. The psychologist wrote in her report that Rosalie showed signs of an anxiety disorder with a possible placement on the autism spectrum. She recommended a 6-month behavioral therapy program. Silas signed the check, and she left. The next week brought a neurologist from Johns Hopkins, a small elderly man whose hands trembled whenever he wasn't holding a medical instrument. He scanned Rosalie's brain, tested her reflexes, shone a light into her eyes until she cried harder. His conclusion was that it could be related to birth trauma and required further study. 3 specialists, 3 completely different diagnoses, and not one of them could answer the simplest question. Why did Rosalie cry? Silas sat in his office after the last specialist had gone. 3 thick reports spread out in front of him, each one bound in luxurious leather stamped with the logos of the most prestigious research institutes in America. He looked at them the way he looked at worthless business contracts, with the cold contempt of a man who measured everything by results. 3 reports, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and his daughter still cried every day. The office door opened and Harris Cole stepped inside, a man of 42 with a sharp angled face and eyes that never revealed emotion. Harris had been Silas's right hand for more than 10 years, the only person allowed to enter this room without knocking. He set a phone on the desk and began to report the situation: trouble at the southern docks, a shipment delayed, and certain partners starting to ask questions. Silas didn't look up. "I don't care. She's still crying." Harris stopped mid-sentence. He'd followed Silas long enough to know when silence was the only sensible move. He picked up the phone, gave a short nod, and stepped back out. But before he left, he added one more line, his voice lower than usual. "I increased security around the house per your order. 2 more patrol vehicles, 4 more night guards, and the main gate is now double locked." Silas nodded without thinking. Security. Protection. That was what he understood. He couldn't heal his daughter's pain, but at least he could make sure no one could touch her. He didn't know that every additional patrol vehicle meant another engine growling across the courtyard. Every additional night guard meant more heavy footsteps on the stone path directly beneath Rosalie's window, and the double-locked gate now slammed shut with twice the force it used to. Everything Silas thought was protection was, in reality, turning the house into a silent machine of torment for his own daughter, day after day, night after night, and he had no idea. That night, Silas walked the second-floor corridor after all the specialists were gone, and all the reports had been filed neatly into a drawer. He stopped outside Rosalie's door. Inside was silence, but it was a heavy silence, thick and dense, like the air before a storm. He put his hand on the doorknob but didn't open it. Standing there in the hallway darkness, Silas Ashford felt something he hadn't felt since he'd been a 13-year-old boy on the streets of Bridgeport. Fear. Not fear of enemies, not fear of losing money, not fear of betrayal. Fear that his daughter would cry like this forever, and that he, the man the entire criminal underworld bowed to, would never find out why. There was a time when Silas Ashford was a man without weakness. He took control of the family empire at the age of 28, after his father died of a heart attack that came in his sleep, quietly and without warning, exactly the way the man had lived. On the day of the funeral, while the most powerful men on the East Coast stood around the casket and watched one another in silence, each measuring who might take the empty chair, Silas stepped forward and said only this: "Everything stays the same, just a different face." No one objected. Not because they feared a man of 28, but because when they looked into his eyes, they saw something more frightening than power. They saw complete emptiness. Silas didn't rage. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to prove anything. He was simply the coldest man in any room he entered. For the next 8 years, no one ever saw Silas Ashford's hand tremble. No one saw him hesitate before any decision, even those that could alter dozens of lives. In his world, people whispered that Silas Ashford had no weakness, and for 8 years, that was true. Then Rosalie was born, and everything changed. Tonight, like every night since the procession of specialists left his home carrying useless reports, Silas sat alone in his ground-floor study. This room was his private fortress, the only place in the house that truly bore his mark. Dark walnut-paneled walls, a set of deep brown leather chairs, and a mahogany desk so heavy it took 4 men to lift it. The desktop was cluttered with objects from 2 different worlds, a neat stack of business files on one side, a phone lighting up endlessly with messages he didn't bother to open, and at the far right corner, closest to his hand, a small silver picture frame, the only photograph in the entire house. In it was a young woman in a white dress, brown hair falling to her shoulders, smiling at someone just outside the frame. Their wedding day. Silas didn't remember much about that day because he wasn't the type to preserve memories. But he remembered that smile, and he remembered the day it vanished forever. It was the day Rosalie was born. That autumn, Silas stood in a hospital corridor when the doctor came out with a look Silas had seen enough times in his life to know bad news was coming. The doctor said the baby was healthy, normal weight, all indicators fine, except for one thing. She showed no response to sound. Preliminary tests indicated complete hearing loss in both ears. Silas listened, still processing that information, when a nurse ran out, and from her expression, he knew his world was about to collapse one more time. His wife was losing blood. Too much. Too fast. They were doing everything they could, but she couldn't bring herself to meet his eyes when she said it. Silas was led into the room. He held the newborn in his arms, tiny and impossibly light, while his wife lay on the bed, her face white as paper. She opened her eyes, looked at him, looked at the child, and whispered so faintly he had to bend close to hear. "Promise me. Promise she'll never know what fear feels like." Silas nodded. He didn't remember if he said anything or not. He only remembered nodding, and a few minutes later, the woman in the silver photograph on his desk stopped breathing. Now, 5 years later, Silas sat staring at that photograph under the soft yellow light of his desk lamp. The promise hadn't faded with time the way he'd expected. It hadn't softened into a distant memory. Instead, it burned him every night, clearer and sharper, because with each passing day, that promise was broken again. His daughter was afraid, every day, every night, afraid of something he couldn't see, couldn't touch, couldn't buy, and couldn't command into disappearing. He'd tried everything. The best doctors, the most patient nannies, the most expensive toys, the most beautiful room. And Rosalie still cried, still curled in on herself by the window, still covered her ears in hopelessness. A knock at the door pulled Silas from his thoughts. Harris entered, this time not with his usual ease. There was urgency in the way he stood, back straighter than usual, hands no longer in his pockets, but hanging at his sides, ready. "You need to hear this." Harris pulled out a chair and sat opposite him, speaking briefly in the style of a man accustomed to delivering bad news. The Southern rival faction, the group that had always known to keep its distance, was starting to move. They'd taken over 2 peripheral business areas, not large ones, but enough to send a message. Worse, rumors were spreading that Silas Ashford was distracted, that the East Coast boss was preoccupied with family matters and no longer watching his empire. Harris said that if there was no early response, small territories would become large ones, and rumors would turn into invitations for anyone reckless enough. Silas listened to everything. He didn't interrupt like he had the day before. He listened because he knew Harris was right. His empire rested on a simple foundation: Power existed only as long as others believed it did. The moment they doubted, everything began to crack. He needed to decide. He needed to act. He needed to become the Silas Ashford the entire East Coast feared. But at that exact moment, from the second floor, down the long hallway and wide staircase, Silas sensed something that wasn't really a sound. He felt the silence, the particular silence of Rosalie's room, heavier and more painful than any crying. He looked at his wife's photograph in its silver frame, then at Harris waiting for orders, the Empire on one side, his daughter on the other, and Silas Ashford, the man said to have no weakness, realized he couldn't save both. Not because he wasn't strong enough, but because he didn't know how. He knew how to fight, how to command, how to make others afraid. No one had ever taught him how to make a 5-year-old child stop crying. Harris still sat there, waiting. Silas said nothing. He only placed his hand on the photograph, his fingers resting against the cold glass, against the smile of the woman who was no longer here to steady him. In his mind, a single sentence echoed, not for Harris, not for his enemies, but for the woman in the photograph and the child sleeping upstairs. I'm failing you both. 3 days after the night Harris reported on the southern rival faction, Silas still hadn't given a single order. Harris didn't ask again because he knew his boss well enough to understand that when Silas was silent, it didn't mean he'd forgotten. It meant he was dealing with something larger inside himself. And Harris was right, but what Silas was wrestling with had nothing to do with strategy or territory. Every night, after everyone in the house had gone to their rooms, after Mrs. Pemberton completed her final round and gently closed Rosalie's door, Silas walked the second-floor corridor and stopped outside his daughter's room. He stood there, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes longer, his hand resting on the doorknob but never turning it. He listened to the silence inside and tried to gather enough courage to step in. A man who'd faced situations most people couldn't imagine now stood before the door of his 5-year-old daughter and couldn't bring himself to open it. But tonight was different. Tonight, after sitting in his study staring at his wife's photograph until the clock struck 2 in the morning, Silas rose from his chair. He didn't think, didn't plan, didn't weigh options. He simply stood up and walked, because he knew that if he stopped to think, he wouldn't go at all. His footsteps echoed softly down the hallway in the deep night, steady and deliberate, the rhythm of a man accustomed to walking as if every step had purpose. But as he neared Rosalie's door, his pace slowed, little by little, as though his legs understood something his mind refused to admit, that beyond that door was a place where his power meant nothing at all. He stopped, placed his hand on the cold brass knob, and for the first time in his life, Silas Ashford did something he'd never done with anyone or anything. He was careful. He turned the handle slowly, very slowly, trying not to make a sound, keeping the hinges from creaking, opening the door just wide enough for his large frame to slip through. Silas Ashford, the man who kicked doors open across the East Coast, was tiptoeing into his daughter's room like a thief. The room was washed in soft blue light from the star-shaped night lamp Mrs. Pemberton always left on. Rosalie lay on the bed, but she wasn't asleep. She was curled in on herself like a small cat, eyes open, staring into the empty space ahead, a pillow clutched tightly in her arms. Silas stepped closer. Each step he took on the thick carpet created a subtle pressure he didn't notice, but the small body on the bed sensed immediately. Rosalie blinked. She knew someone was approaching, not through sound, but through the way the ground beneath her changed its rhythm. Silas sat on the edge of the bed. It dipped under his weight, and Rosalie turned her head. Her eyes, still rimmed with red from her last bout of crying, lifted to her father's face. Silas reached out and placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder. His hand was almost the size of her entire shoulder, rough and heavy. He didn't know what to say, though it didn't matter because Rosalie couldn't hear. But the problem wasn't words. The problem was that Silas Ashford had never in his life learned how to be gentle. He didn't know how to touch someone without carrying the weight of authority. He didn't know how to rest a hand on a child's shoulder without turning it into an unspoken command. And Rosalie felt it. The instant her father's hand touched her shoulder, her body reacted before thought could intervene. Her eyes widened, not in surprise or joy at seeing her father, but in the way a small creature's eyes widen when it recognizes danger. Pure fear, raw and unfiltered, flooded her brown eyes like water rising in a glass vessel. Then she recoiled. Her entire small body drew back toward the head of the bed, both arms wrapping the pillow tight like a shield. her gaze locked on her father's hand as if it were the most frightening thing in the world. Silas didn't pull his hand right away. He held it suspended in the air where her shoulder had been a second earlier, and stared at it. This hand had signed hundreds of orders, each capable of changing the lives of dozens of families. This hand had shaken with the most powerful men in America. This hand controlled an empire stretching from Connecticut to Florida, and now it was being rejected by his own daughter. The feeling wasn't like any failure Silas had ever known. When he lost a deal, he got angry and found a way to take it back. When he was betrayed, he dealt with it coldly and moved on. When rivals challenged him, he struck back 10 times harder. Every failure in his life had an enemy to blame, a strategy to fix, an action to answer with. This recoil didn't. There was no one to blame, no strategy to apply. The 5-year-old child before him wasn't an opponent, wasn't a subordinate, wasn't someone he could command or persuade. She was simply afraid of him, and that truth was more personal, deeper, sharper than any blade ever aimed his way, because this time Silas Ashford had no one to blame but himself. He lowered his hand, stood up. His body moved on instinct, the instinct of a man accustomed to retreating when he couldn't control a situation. He turned toward the door, and as his hand closed around the knob, every emotion he'd suppressed all night, all week, all 5 years, funneled into a single act. He closed the door, harder than necessary, not on purpose, not out of anger at Rosalie, but out of instinct, out of habit, because Silas Ashford closed doors the way he did everything in life, decisively, forcefully, without looking back. The door slammed through the second-floor corridor, rebounded off stone walls, traveled through wooden frames, and spilled into the room he'd just left. Inside, on the large bed, Rosalie curled tighter. The vibration from the door traveled through the bed frame, through the mattress, through the pillow she clutched, and straight into her small folded body. Her shoulders lifted, her head bowed, her arms tightened around the pillow until her knuckles turned white. She trembled, harder than before her father entered, harder than at any point that night, because the shock came too close, too sudden, too strong, and she had no way of knowing it wouldn't come again. Outside, in the dark corridor, Silas leaned back against the opposite wall. He didn't turn on the lights. He didn't move. He just stood there in the darkness, arms hanging uselessly at his sides, staring at the door he'd closed, unaware that on the other side, his daughter was trembling because of him. Soft footsteps approached from the far end of the hall. Harris appeared, still impeccably dressed despite the late hour, because Harris Cole never truly slept when Silas was awake. He stopped a few steps away, looked at his boss standing motionless in the dark, and asked quietly if everything was all right. Silas didn't turn around. He told him to leave him alone. Harris paused for a second, then nodded even though Silas couldn't see, and walked away. The sound of his footsteps faded and disappeared at the end of the corridor. Silas remained where he was. A minute. 5 minutes. Maybe longer. He stood in the dark and felt something he didn't have a name for. Heavier than fear, deeper than anger, wider than grief. It felt like a pit opening in the center of his chest, and he was standing at the edge looking down without seeing the bottom. His entire life, Silas Ashford had always known who he was. The boss. The one who gave orders. The one in control. The man the entire East Coast bowed to. But tonight, standing in a dark hallway with the memory of his daughter's trembling echoing in his mind even though he couldn't truly hear it, Silas Ashford, for the first time in his life, wanted to disappear. Not to run, not to give up, but simply to vanish, so his daughter wouldn't have to fear one more person in a house already full of things that frightened her. The next morning, after Silas left the house before dawn to deal with the things he'd put off for far too long, an old silver-gray car pulled up at the rear service gate of the estate. A woman of 31 stepped out, wearing a simple brown coat, her hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, her face the kind you could see 10 times and still not remember, not because she was unattractive, but because she'd learned how to be invisible. Her name was Helen Whitmore, the new housekeeper, hired by Mrs. Pemberton after the last one quit without notice. Helen spoke so little that during the interview Mrs. Pemberton had to ask 3 times whether she had any questions, and all 3 times Helen shook her head, then asked in return, "What time do I start?" From the back seat of the old car climbed a 4-year-old boy clutching a chipped tin box of chalk. Jonah Whitmore had big round eyes, a light brown that looked almost like honey when the light caught them, And those eyes didn't look at the world the way most 4-year-olds did. Most children glanced at things quickly, hopping from one to the next like butterflies landing on flowers. Jonah looked at everything as if he were trying to read a book written in a language he hadn't learned, but somehow understood by instinct. He looked inside things. Helen led her son through the service gate and quietly told him to sit outside in the yard and not go into the house. Jonah nodded and obediently sat down on the stone step beside the side walkway, opened his chalk box, and began to draw on the paving stones. He drew circles, squares, and sometimes shapes only he knew how to name. But after a few minutes, his eyes began to wander. He watched the guards in dark suits pacing the path. He watched the glossy black cars lined up in the courtyard. He watched the heavy iron gate at the front. Then he lifted his gaze and saw the little girl. On the second floor, behind the large window, a girl in a white dress sat with both hands pressed to the glass. She was older than Jonah, dressed more beautifully than any child he'd ever seen, but her face held something Jonah recognized instantly, even though he didn't have a word for it. Loneliness. The kind of loneliness that when you see it, you know it's been there a long time. Jonah stopped drawing. He held the chalk suspended above the stone and stared up at her. Just then, a black SUV turned into the courtyard through the main gate. The engine roared, tires crushed gravel, and the iron gate slammed shut behind it with the familiar heavy sound. Jonah saw the second-floor window pane tremble slightly, and at the same time he saw the girl behind the glass flinch. Her shoulders lifted, her head dipped, her whole body shrinking as if something had been thrown at her that the naked eye couldn't see. Jonah frowned. He looked at the vehicle that had just parked, then back up at the window, and said nothing. On the second day, Jonah sat on the step again, while his mother worked inside. Again, he watched. This time he didn't draw anything. He only sat with the chalk box beside his foot, honey-colored eyes fixed on the second-floor window. He saw it happen again. Every time there was a large movement in the courtyard, the girl behind the glass reacted. It wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence. There was a connection, and Jonah felt it with the same certainty he felt when he knew that if he stomped hard enough, the ground would tremble beneath his feet. He didn't know the word vibration. He didn't know sound waves or frequency. He was 4. His vocabulary didn't fill more than a small notebook. But some things didn't need words to be understood. He knew that when his mother walked across the wooden floor at home, he could feel her footsteps through the soles of his feet even with his eyes closed. He knew that when a big bus rumbled past their small apartment, the glass of water on the table would ripple. He knew the world wasn't only what eyes could see and ears could hear, but also what traveled silently through the ground, through walls, through glass, through anything a hand could touch. And he began to think, in the wordless language of a 4-year-old, that maybe the girl upstairs could feel those things too. But unlike him, she didn't understand what they were, and because she didn't understand, she was afraid. That night, in their small one-bedroom apartment in the working-class part of South Hartford, Jonah lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. He didn't tell his mother about the girl behind the glass. He didn't know how, but the image played over and over in his mind. The girl shrinking back, the girl pressing her hands to the glass, the girl crying without sound. Jonah had seen plenty of children cry where he lived, crying from hunger, crying from scraped knees, crying because someone took a toy. But that girl cried differently. She cried as if the whole world were crashing into her and she didn't know how to stop it. On the third day, Jonah sat on the step longer than usual. The chalk box lay open, but he didn't draw. A piece of white chalk rested in his hand, squeezed so tightly that chalk dust clung to his small fingers. His heart beat fast. The kind of fast beat even a 4-year-old could tell was different. He looked up at the second-floor window. She was there, as always, hands on the glass, eyes staring down at the courtyard. He'd never gone inside that house. It was huge and unfamiliar, full of adults in dark clothing and rules he didn't understand. His mother had been very clear. Sit outside. Don't go in. But every time he lifted his gaze and saw the girl behind the glass, something inside him, stronger than his mother's instructions, stronger than his fear of the strange house, pushed him to stand. Jonah got to his feet, slipped the piece of chalk into his pocket, and walked toward the back door his mother used each morning. The rear service door off the kitchen wasn't locked. Jonah gave it a gentle push, and it opened with a small creak that he felt through his palm more than he heard. Inside was a narrow hallway leading into the kitchen, where the smell of coffee mixed with floor cleaner. No one was there. His mother was working upstairs, and everyone else in the house seemed occupied with their own tasks. Jonah stepped inside, his thin canvas shoes touching the icy marble floor, and he felt the difference at once. The floor in his apartment was old wood, warm and slightly soft underfoot, but the floor here was hard and cold, and each step sent a faint vibration back through the thin soles into his feet. He walked through a kitchen, larger than the entire apartment he shared with his mother, past a dining room with a table long enough for 20 people to sit, a size he couldn't understand the need for, past a living room with sofas he'd only ever seen in television commercials at the laundromat, with framed paintings whose frames alone probably cost more than everything his mother owned combined. But Jonah didn't stop at any of it. He wasn't here to look around. He had a purpose. His honey-colored eyes stayed fixed ahead, searching for the staircase to the second floor. And when he found it, he climbed step by step, one hand sliding along the polished wooden banister that was wider than his entire arm. The stairs creaked softly under the small weight of a 4-year-old, and Jonah felt each sound through his feet like a reminder that he was somewhere he didn't belong. The second-floor hallway was long and silent. Jonah walked down it, tiny between towering walls and a ceiling that seemed impossibly high, like an ant moving through the belly of a castle. He passed 3 closed doors before he found the room he was looking for. The door was slightly open. Inside, Rosalie sat on the floor beside the large window, in the exact spot he'd seen her from the courtyard for 3 days now. Up close, everything was different. She wasn't just sitting. She had her knees pulled tight to her chest, her arms wrapped around her legs, her whole body folded into a small round shape, as if she were trying to turn herself into a stone the world would overlook. Tear tracks shone faintly on her cheeks in the afternoon light coming through the glass, but there was no sound at all. No sobbing, no sharp breaths, nothing but the absolute silence of a child who'd cried so many times that tears now came as naturally as breathing. Jonah stopped 4 or 5 steps away. His heart was racing. He stood in the doorway between the hall and the room, feeling like he was facing a wounded bird and didn't know how to keep from frightening it further. He didn't know sign language. He didn't know how to communicate with someone who couldn't hear. He didn't even know that idea existed. He was 4 years old, and all he had was instinct, 3 days of watching, and a memory. The memory was of his mother. Whenever Jonah was sad, when he missed his father, when he didn't understand why their home had only 2 people while his friends' homes had 3 or 4, his mother never spoke right away. She didn't explain. She didn't comfort him with words. She didn't try to cheer him up. She just sat down beside him, silent, present. And that presence, simple and asking nothing, was always what eased the sadness inside him. So Jonah did what his mother would do. He stepped into the room, slowly, carefully, and sat down on the floor about an arm's length from Rosalie. He didn't speak. He didn't touch her. He just sat there. Rosalie felt the change immediately. The floor carried a new rhythm to her body, the subtle vibration of another person's steps and weight. She lifted her head, eyes red and wet, and saw the boy. Her first reaction was the same one she'd had with her father the night before. She recoiled. Her shoulders rose. Her body curled in even tighter, as if that were still possible. Her eyes locked onto Jonah with the wary alertness of a child who was used to being grabbed, pulled, lifted, by large hurried hands trying to fix her. But Jonah didn't move. He sat still, his hands resting on his thighs, and he smiled. It wasn't a wide or excited smile. It was small and gentle, like sunlight filtering through a thin layer of cloud, not blinding, just warm enough to know it was there. The smile said he wasn't dangerous. They sat like that for a while. Rosalie watched him. He watched her. No one moved. Then Jonah did something he didn't think through or plan. He just did it because it felt right. He lifted his right hand, placed his palm on his chest over his heart, and tapped lightly. Once, twice, 3 times. A slow, steady rhythm, like a heartbeat. He felt his heart beating under his hand and tapped along with it, showing her. Rosalie watched his hand on his chest. Her head tilted slightly, like a bird listening for something it had never heard before. The tears on her cheeks didn't dry yet, but they stopped falling. Then Jonah slowly extended his hand toward her. Slow, very slow. His small arm reached out, palm open and facing upward, and stopped in the air a short distance from her chest. He didn't touch her. He just held his hand there and looked into her eyes. His eyes asked a question his mouth didn't say. May I? 3 seconds passed. Maybe 4, maybe longer. But in that room, between 2 children, Time grew thick and slow, like honey dripping from a spoon. Rosalie looked at the small hand hovering in front of her, looked back at the calm, honey-colored eyes, looked down at the hand, looked up again, and then, as lightly as a breeze too soft to move a leaf, she nodded. Jonah placed his palm on Rosalie's chest, gently, warm. His small hand rested over the thin fabric of her dress, right above her heart, and he kept it there. He didn't tap, he didn't press, he just rested it there. And in that moment, something shifted. Not a miracle, no bright light or dramatic music, just Rosalie's breathing, which had been shallow and broken, beginning to slow, gradually, like a violent wave settling into ripples. Her shoulders, which had been lifted almost to her ears for so long, began to lower, a little, then a little more. The tears stopped completely, not because she forced them back, but because something inside her, the faucet no one had ever found a way to turn off, quietly closed on its own. For the first time, someone was beside her in the right way, not with medical terms, not with expensive toys, not with a hurried midnight embrace, but with presence, with a heartbeat, with the patience to wait for permission. Jonah held his hand there a few seconds longer, then withdrew it. He placed his palm on the wooden floor and tapped lightly. The floor answered with a low, gentle vibration that spread beneath both children. Rosalie watched his hand on the floor. Then Jonah stood, walked to the window, and placed his palm against the glass. He waited, and right then, as a coincidence that wasn't really coincidence because cars came and went constantly in this house, a black SUV passed through the courtyard below. The glass trembled faintly beneath his palm, a vibration so slight it was almost unnoticeable, unless you were paying attention. Jonah turned to look at Rosalie. Then he repeated the sequence, slowly and clearly. Hand to his chest, light tapping, heartbeat. Hand to the floor, light tapping, deep vibration. Hand to the glass, waiting, gentle vibration. Chest, floor, glass. Then he pointed to Rosalie. Her eyes widened, not with fear like the night she'd seen her father, but because for the first time in 5 years, someone had shown her that what invaded her body every day wasn't a monster, wasn't a punishment, wasn't something supernatural. It was vibration. It was everywhere. In her chest, under the floor, in the glass. It was the same thing, only different in strength. And it had a name. Rosalie slowly placed her palm against the glass. She held it there, looking out at the courtyard, waiting. Below, a car door slammed shut. The vibration traveled through the glass into her hand. Her body tensed by instinct, her shoulders beginning to rise. But then she looked at Jonah. He sat calmly, his hand still on the glass, unafraid. And Rosalie understood. The vibration came and went. It didn't stay. It didn't hurt her. It just passed through. She didn't cry. For the first time in a very long while, she felt vibration move through her body and didn't cry. The two children sat side by the window, palms against the glass, in silence. Outside, the world went on as usual. Cars kept moving, gates kept closing, guards kept patrolling. But inside that room, for the first time, someone had translated the world into a language Rosalie Ashford could understand. And that translator wasn't a doctor, wasn't a specialist, wasn't an experienced nanny. It was a 4-year-old boy with white chalk dust smeared inside his pockets. Mrs. Pemberton was carrying a tray of tea up to the 2nd floor when she noticed Rosalie's door was slightly ajar. She stopped. That door was always kept shut because the little girl didn't like sudden changes in the air when it opened, though no one understood why. Mrs. Pemberton set the tray down on a small table in the hallway and moved closer. She peered through the crack and froze. On Rosalie's floor, right beside the large window, the boss's daughter was sitting next to a little boy Mrs. Pemberton had never seen before. A tiny boy in old jeans and a t-shirt smudged with white chalk dust was pressing his hand to the window pane, and Rosalie was doing the same. Mrs. Pemberton didn't even have time to process the picture. The instincts of a woman who'd lived in this house long enough to know that anyone who appeared near Rosalie without permission was a serious problem took over, and she turned at once, left the tea tray behind, and hurried downstairs. Silas had been home for less than 10 minutes. He was standing in his study, tie loosened, phone in hand as he read messages from Harris about the situation in the South. When Mrs. Pemberton appeared in the doorway, her face drained of color. "Mr. Ashford, there's a child in Rosalie's room." Silas didn't ask which child. He didn't ask how the child got in. He didn't ask any of the questions an ordinary man would ask. He set the phone down on the desk and stepped out of the room with the speed and decisiveness of a man who'd spent his life reacting to threats before they had time to become real danger. His footsteps on the stairs were fast and heavy, each step carrying the weight of 90 kilograms of muscle and 41 years. Lived in a world where hesitation could be the last thing you ever did. The second-floor corridor shortened under his long stride. His Mafia instincts snapped fully awake. Who had entered his daughter's space? How? For what purpose? And who would pay for this security failure? By the time he reached Rosalie's door, every muscle in his body was prepared for a response that in his world could be anything. He shoved the door wide and stepped in. Then he stopped. On the floor beside the large window, his daughter was sitting next to a boy he'd never seen. The boy was small, very small, maybe 4 years old or even younger, wearing cheap clothes with white chalk dust clinging to the pockets. Silas's first instinct was territorial, the instinct of an animal defending its den. A stranger was sitting beside his daughter, in his house, in his child's private room. His jaw tightened, his shoulders tensed, and he opened his mouth to say something sharp and final. But before the words could take shape, his eyes caught something he had almost forgotten the shape of. Rosalie wasn't crying. His daughter was sitting there with her palm on the glass, eyes open, shoulders relaxed, and her face held no tears. No red rims around her eyes, no raised shoulders, no curled-in body, no signs of the fear he'd watched every day for 5 years. And she was looking at the boy beside her with an expression Silas had never seen on his daughter's face. Peace. Not the tired peace after crying until there was nothing left. Real peace, the kind a child has when she's somewhere she feels safe. Silas stood there between the open door and the 2 children on the floor, and the anger in him hit that image and cracked apart. It didn't vanish. It was still there somewhere underneath, because Silas Ashford didn't truly run out of anger, but it was shoved aside by something stronger that he didn't have a name for. What's going on in here? His voice carried through the room, low and sharp, the voice of a man used to giving orders, not asking. The boy on the floor looked up. And in that instant, Silas saw something he didn't expect. The boy's eyes, a light brown close to honey, lifted to his face, and fear was in them, plain and undisguised, because a 4-year-old didn't know how to hide feelings. The boy was afraid. Seeing Silas Ashford filling the doorway, a face carved from stone, eyes cold as steel, would make any adult step back, let alone a 4-year-old who weighed less than 15 kilograms. But the boy didn't run. He didn't stand. He didn't retreat. Instead, he did something Silas would remember for the rest of his life. He glanced down at Rosalie, as if checking whether she was all right, as if making sure the sudden appearance of this large man hadn't frightened her back into terror. Only when he saw Rosalie still calm, her hand still on the glass, did he look back at Silas. That small, almost forgettable act was, in truth, the bravest thing Silas Ashford had ever witnessed. A 4-year-old boy, facing the most frightening man in the house, chose to check that the girl beside him was safe before he worried about himself. In more than 10 years of running his empire, Silas had hundreds of men under him, large, strong men who swore loyalty, and not one of them had ever put someone else's safety before his own, with the natural purity that this 4-year-old had just shown him. The boy looked at Silas, still afraid but not fleeing, and began to explain. He didn't use long sentences or complicated words, because he didn't have them. He used his hands. He pointed down to the floor and tapped his palm lightly on the wood. Then he pointed up to the window and pressed his hand to the glass. Then he placed his hand on his chest, where his heart beat. Floor. Glass. Chest. Then he spoke, his voice small but so clear each word seemed to carve itself into the air. She feels it. Every time there's noise, it's like it's inside her. It hurts her and it scares her. The room went still. Silas stared at the boy, stared at his daughter, stared at the window. Then he did something he'd never done with any specialist, any doctor, any psychologist, in 5 years. He listened. He walked to the window slowly and placed his palm against the glass. Right then, down in the courtyard, a car engine turned over. The vibration traveled through the frame, through the pane, into his palm. Small, but unmistakable. Unmistakable enough that he couldn't understand how he'd never felt it before. And then everything came rushing in, not slowly like rising water, but like a tidal wave. Every black SUV that rolled into the courtyard every day. Every time the iron gate slammed shut, every heavy footstep of the patrol passing beneath Rosalie's window, every vehicle Harris had added on his order to increase security, every night guard he'd demanded, every time the double-locked gate closed with twice the force. All of it. Everything he thought was protecting his daughter had been crushing her from the inside, every day, every night. And the door slammed the night before, when he'd left his daughter's room with his heavy hand and his decisive habit. That single shock had made Rosalie curl in and tremble worse than ever. She hadn't been afraid of him. She'd been afraid of the vibration he carried into the room every time he came close. Silas stood there with his hand on the glass and said nothing. His eyes looked out at the courtyard, but he saw nothing, because inside his mind something was collapsing, something he'd built for 5 years. The belief that he was doing the right thing, that money and power would solve it, that the problem was somewhere outside him, not in him. In the doorway, Mrs. Pemberton stood motionless with one hand covering her mouth. She'd heard the boy's words. She'd watched her employer place his palm on the glass, and she was thinking about every time she'd said, "It's just a habit. Children do that," whenever Rosalie covered her ears, and shame made her eyes burn. On the floor, Jonah sat quietly beside Rosalie. He'd said his piece, and now he was simply there, his small hand resting beside Rosalie's, the two children silent as the adults finally began to understand. No one moved. No one spoke. The room filled with the heaviest silence the house had ever held, heavier than Rosalie's silence, because this was the silence of people who'd just realized they'd been wrong and didn't yet know where to begin fixing it. Silas lowered his hand from the glass. He stared at his palm, the palm that seconds ago had still felt the faint vibration from the car below. He turned and looked at his daughter, at the boy, at the tiny chalk-smudged hand lying still on the floor beside Rosalie. And for the first time in 41 years, Silas Ashford, the most powerful Mafia boss on the east coast of America, stood in a room and didn't know what to say. 4 days after the afternoon when Silas stood in his daughter's room and felt vibration through the glass for the first time, the house began to change. But change inside a mansion as large as a small neighborhood never happened overnight. The team Silas hired from a Boston company to install sound-insulating windows had only finished the ground floor and part of the second-floor corridor. Rosalie's room still had the old glass, beautiful and expensive panes that carried vibration as clearly as a mute loudspeaker. The new soft flooring had only been laid in her bedroom and the short stretch of hallway outside the door, while the rest of the house remained original hard oak. The mansion stood halfway between what it had been and what it was becoming, half old and half new, like a living creature in the middle of shedding its skin. That afternoon, Rosalie and Jonah were sitting on the floor of the small sitting room beside her bedroom on the second floor, a space that had never been used before, and had now become where the two children spent most of their time together. Jonah was teaching Rosalie a game he'd invented himself, one without a name because it didn't need one, only 2 hands and a wooden floor. He placed Rosalie's palm flat against the floor and tapped lightly beside it with his other hand, a gentle, steady tap like a heartbeat. Rosalie felt the small vibration travel through the wood into her palm and looked at Jonah. He smiled and nodded, meaning it was safe. Then he tapped harder, faster, 3 or 4 times in a row. Rosalie frowned slightly, noticing the difference. Jonah raised one finger, his face more serious but not afraid, meaning pay attention but it's all right. Then he delivered a single, very hard tap, loud enough to make a sharp sound, and immediately lifted both hands off the floor, palms out, his face breaking into an exaggerated expression like a child actor, eyes wide and mouth round, before instantly relaxing his shoulders and smiling broadly. It meant it was strong, but it was over. See? Nothing happened. Rosalie watched him, and the corners of her mouth lifted just slightly. Not yet a smile, but the closest step toward one she'd taken in a very long time. They played the game again and again, Jonah tapping with different strengths, while Rosalie learned to tell them apart through her palm. Light meant safe. Strong meant pay attention. Very strong, but only once meant it comes and it goes. Slowly, in the wordless language of 2 children, Rosalie began to understand a logic no specialist had ever managed to teach her with charts or terminology, that not every vibration was something to fear. Some were the world whispering. Some were the world speaking loudly. And even when the world shouted, the shout would pass. Then the sky outside changed. No one noticed at first because it happened quickly, the way New England weather was known to do. Blazing sunshine at midday and storms by late afternoon. Gray clouds rolled in from the west, low and heavy, and the light in the room shifted from warm gold to cold gray within minutes. Then came the first thunderclap, distant and deep, like an enormous door slamming shut somewhere beyond the horizon. The vibration traveled through the air, through brick walls, through the old window frames not yet replaced, and into the glass. The pane trembled. Rosalie had her hand on the floor and felt it first there, through the wood, and then almost immediately through the air around her. Her body reacted at once, following instincts carved over 5 years. She curled inward, shoulders lifting, eyes widening in pure panic. Her small hands clutched Jonah's arm, gripping so tightly her fingers left marks on his skin, and her whole body leaned toward him as if he were the only thing keeping her from being swept away. All the progress of the past days, the tapping game, the almost smile, the fragile calm, seemed to be erased in a single instant by distant thunder she couldn't hear but felt in every cell. Jonah didn't panic. His arm hurt under her grip, but he didn't pull away. He stayed still, let her hold on as long as she needed, and waited for the first wave of fear to pass. Then, when he felt her fingers loosen just a little, he moved. He gently freed her hands from his arm, not pushing them away but holding them, and guided her palm toward the window glass. Rosalie resisted, instinctively pulling back, but Jonah was patient, holding lightly, not forcing, only guiding. Her hand touched the glass, and right then, the second thunderclap came, closer than the first. The glass vibrated under her palm. She shuddered and tried to pull away, but Jonah held gently. He placed his other hand on his chest and tapped softly in a steady rhythm, a heartbeat, and looked into her eyes. His face was calm, the tapping on his chest unchanged, telling her to look at him. His heart was still beating normally. He wasn't afraid, so this wasn't something to fear. Then he turned and pointed out the window. Outside, rain began to fall, heavy drops striking the glass and streaming down. Trees in the courtyard swayed in the wind, leaves flying, branches bending but not breaking. The ground darkened with rain but didn't split. The fountain trembled but didn't topple. The world was shaking, loud, chaotic, but nothing was collapsing. Nothing was breaking. Everything was still standing. Rosalie looked at the rain, looked at the moving trees, looked at the ground holding firm. Then she looked at Jonah, calm face, steady heartbeat tapping beneath his palm. Then she looked back at the glass beneath her own hand. Thunder rolled a third time, the closest and strongest yet. The whole room trembled, not just the glass but the floor, the walls, the air itself. Rosalie didn't curl in. Her lips trembled slightly, and her fingers tightened on the glass, and then loosened again. But her shoulders didn't rise. Her body didn't shrink. Her hand stayed on the glass. And then, slowly, like the sun rising after a long night no one dared believe would end, the corner of Rosalie's mouth lifted. She smiled. Not a big smile, not a radiant one, just a slight curve on small lips. But it held more than any smile the house had ever seen, because this was the first time Rosalie Ashford felt vibration move through her body and chose not to be afraid. Not because someone held her, not because someone explained it, but because she saw the world shaking outside and still standing, saw the boy beside her with his heart beating steadily, and decided on her own that if the world didn't collapse and the person next to her wasn't afraid, then she didn't need to be either. She was learning to own her sensations instead of being controlled by them. Outside the room, in the hallway, Silas stood in the shadows watching through the narrow opening of the door. He'd been there for some time, maybe since before the first thunder, maybe after. He didn't know. He saw his daughter curl inward at the thunder. He saw the boy calmly guide Rosalie's hand to the glass. He saw the third thunderclap, the strongest, and his daughter didn't cry. And he saw the smile, that tiny smile on a face he'd looked at thousands of times but had never seen curve that way. His daughter was smiling in the middle of a storm. Silas placed his hand on the doorknob but didn't open it. He wanted to step inside, to sit beside his daughter, to be part of the moment. But he understood with an instinct that had nothing to do with power or control, that this time, his daughter didn't need him. She didn't need anyone to enter and interrupt what was happening. She was standing on her own, in her own way, beside someone she trusted, and Silas stood there, hand on the knob, watching his daughter smile through the crack in the door, and felt two things at once he hadn't believed could exist together. Pain, because he wasn't the one who brought that smile, and beauty, because the smile existed whether he was there or not. which meant his daughter was beginning to heal from the inside, in the deepest place no embrace, no check, and no command could ever reach. 2 weeks after the afternoon storm, the house finished shedding its old skin. The crew from Boston installed the final sound-insulating window on the second floor on a quiet Wednesday morning, and when they left, the mansion seemed to hold a different kind of silence. Not the heavy, dense silence Silas had felt night after night outside his daughter's door, but a light, open silence, like the pause between two breaths. The new glass was 3 times thicker than the old, designed to absorb vibration from outside instead of carrying it straight in. The entire second floor was rebuilt with a special layer beneath the new wood, a material the specialist explained would cut the path vibration used to travel from the ground up to the surface. Rosalie's room was redesigned completely. Every piece of metal that could resonate was replaced with wood or fabric. The bookcase legs were fitted with rubber padding, and her bed was set on an isolation base, so effective she could barely feel anything even when someone walked heavily just outside her door. But those physical changes were only half of it. The other half came from the orders Silas gave Harris one morning, brief and without explanation. The style of a boss, different only in content. All vehicles entering the property were to park in the rear lot at least 300 meters from the main house. No car was allowed to drive through the front courtyard beneath Rosalie's windows. Daytime security patrols had to switch to soft-soled shoes whenever they were within range of the main house, and their steps on the stone path were to be as quiet as walking on carpet. The main iron gate was fitted with a new hydraulic closing system that lowered it slowly over 10 seconds, instead of slamming down with the old violent crash. And every meeting, every business appointment, everything tied to the empire Silas ran, was moved to a private office in downtown Hartford, never hosted at the house again. Harris received the orders and carried them out one by one without asking why, because he'd been in Rosalie's room that afternoon and had watched his boss place his hand on the glass, and that was enough to tell him that Silas Ashford's world had turned on a new axis. Yet in all those changes, the biggest shift wasn't the windows or the floors or the security protocols. It was attitude. From that day forward, no one in the house spoke of Rosalie as a problem to be solved. Mrs. Pemberton stopped writing down the number of times she cried each day in the logbook she'd kept for 2 years. No one counted anymore. No one compared today to yesterday searching for signs of improvement or decline. Instead, they began asking different questions. Not why is she crying, but what is she feeling? Not how do we make her stop, but what does she need to feel safe? The difference between those questions sounded small, but it was the distance between 2 worlds. One was the adult world that wanted to fix a child into matching their definition of normal. The other was the world of people who'd accepted that this child experienced everything differently, and instead of forcing her to change, they changed the world around her. New specialists were invited in, not the type who recited training manuals the way the earlier ones had, but the kind who knew how to sit on the floor, how to observe before judging, how to listen to a child with their eyes instead of their ears. They taught Rosalie to tell different sensations apart, to be warned before something happened instead of being ambushed by it. And Rosalie responded. Not instantly, not dramatically, but slowly, the way a flower opens when it learns the sunlight won't burn it. She began to distinguish strong from light, near from far, sudden from gradual, the way other children distinguished loud from soft, high from low. Each sensation carried meaning, and that meaning gave her what she'd never had: control. When you understand what is happening to your body, you stop being its victim. You become the one who reads it, who translates it, and eventually who owns it. And from that control, Rosalie found safety. Jonah became a natural part of her life without anyone having to assign it or arrange it officially. No one called him an aide or a therapeutic companion or any professional name at all. He was simply there. Every morning when his mother came to work, Jonah walked into the house, climbed the stairs to the second floor, and sat on the floor of the small sitting room beside Rosalie. He drew with chalk on a small blackboard Mrs. Pemberton bought for him, and now and then he took Rosalie's hand and let her feel different surfaces. The wood of the bookcase, warm and smooth. The fabric of the curtains, soft and faintly alive when a light breeze moved through. The water in the glass bowl Mrs. Pemberton used for flowers, cold and gently rippling when a finger touched it. Each surface was a small world, and Jonah showed Rosalie that the world wasn't only the frightening vibration of iron gates and cars, but also the gentle vibration of water, of cloth, of sun-warmed wood. The tears came less and less. First in the daytime, Rosalie stopped crying by the window because the new glass no longer carried vibration the way it used to, and even when she felt something through the floor or the walls, she looked to Jonah, saw him calm, and reminded herself it was all right. Then at night, Mrs. Pemberton realized the faint midnight creaking of the bed grew rare. Rosalie still woke sometimes, but instead of clutching her pillow and rocking, she placed her hand on the bed frame, felt, then lay back down on her own. Mrs. Pemberton wrote it down, not in the old book that counted crying spells, but in a new one, and instead of grim tally marks, she wrote short notes. Quiet night. Rosalie went back to sleep by herself. Then one day, the tears didn't appear at all. Not in the morning, not at noon, not in the late afternoon when long shadows stretched and Rosalie used to be most fragile. The whole day passed and her cheeks stayed dry. Mrs. Pemberton noticed that in the evening when she came to check the room and found Rosalie asleep, peaceful, her pillow placed neatly instead of crushed in her arms, she stood in the doorway watching the child sleep, and for the first time in 2 years of working in this house, she didn't feel heavy when she stepped back into the hallway. That night, close to 11 o'clock, Helen was wiping down a table in the ground floor living room when she noticed the door to Silas's study was slightly open. In all the weeks she'd worked here, that door had always been shut. Helen knew the rules. On her first day, she'd been told the Ashford study was off limits, cleaned only when requested, and only when Mr. Ashford wasn't home. But tonight the door was ajar, and there was no sound inside. Maybe the boss had forgotten to close it before going upstairs. Helen meant to walk past, but her feet stopped. Through the crack, the soft yellow glow of a desk lamp spilled a thin stripe of light across the hallway floor, and in that stripe, she could see part of the large desk, part of a stack of files, and in the corner, closest to her, the silver picture frame. She'd seen that frame many times while cleaning, but she'd never really looked at it because she wasn't the kind of person who pried into other people's private lives. Tonight, though, in the near-total quiet of a house that had learned to breathe more gently, the lamp hit the photograph at an angle she'd never seen before, and the woman's face in the picture came into focus through the opening. Young, beautiful, smiling, and there was something around her eyes that resembled Rosalie so closely that Helen felt her chest tighten. She stood there only a few seconds before a voice spoke directly behind her. "What are you looking for?" Helen spun around, her heart jumping into her throat. Silas stood less than 2 steps away, still in his dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, a glass of water in his hand. He didn't look angry. It was simply the direct question of a man used to controlling everything that happened in his own house. Helen took 1 step back, gripping her cloth. "I'm sorry, Mr. Ashford. The door was open and I'm sorry. I shouldn't have stopped." She turned to go, but Silas didn't say anything to hold her there. He only stepped past her, pushed the study door wider, and walked in. He sat down, set the glass on the desk, and looked at the silver frame. Then, without turning back to Helen, still standing in the doorway, he spoke in a voice she'd never heard from him. Not cold, not commanding, just the voice of a tired man speaking to the empty air in front of him. "She died the day Rosalie was born. The last thing she said was to make me promise our daughter would never know what fear feels like." Helen stayed still at the threshold. She didn't step in because she hadn't been invited, but she didn't walk away either, because something in Silas's voice kept her there, a raw honesty she recognized instantly, because she'd heard that same voice in herself for 2 years now, the voice of someone who'd lost their other half and was trying to carry the weight of both. Silence passed, maybe 10 seconds, maybe longer, and then Helen spoke. Gently, not because she thought she should, but because it found its way out on its own. "My husband died 2 years ago. The last thing he said was to tell me to make sure Jonah always knows he's loved." Silas turned his head and looked at her for the first time since sitting down. In a study paneled in dark wood under soft yellow light, the 2 adults stood on opposite sides of a doorway and looked at each other with an expression neither of them used in ordinary life. Not the look of an employer and a housekeeper. Not the look of a man and a woman. The look of 2 people who'd stood in a hospital room and heard the last words of someone they loved, then walked out alone with a child in their arms, and the rest of life stretching ahead like a road without a map. 2 promises, strangely alike. 2 people missing half of themselves. 2 people raising a child alone. Yet their circumstances were so different they might have belonged to different planets. One sat in a walnut-lined study, the owner of an empire spanning the East Coast, with hundreds of men under him, with money to buy almost anything in the world. and still failing to keep his promise for 5 years. The other stood at the doorway with a cleaning cloth in her hand, living in a one-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood, with nothing but a housekeeper's wages, and her son, a 4-year-old boy with a chipped box of chalk, loved. So, naturally, he walked into a stranger's house to sit beside a crying girl, without anyone teaching him how. Silas looked at Helen and asked the question he'd wanted to ask since the first day he saw her son sitting beside Rosalie. "How did your boy do it? How did he know what my daughter needed?" Helen was quiet for a moment, not because she was searching for an answer. She'd known it for a long time, but because she was weighing whether a man like Silas Ashford could hear a truth so simple, it almost insulted all the money he'd spent, all the experts he'd hired, all the effort he'd poured in. Then she said, in the calmest voice she had, "He didn't know. He just stayed. That's all children need sometimes. Someone who stays." Silas didn't answer right away. He looked down at the desk, at the glass of water, at the photograph, and inside him Helen's words dropped like a stone into a deep well. It hit bottom, and the echo traveled into every corner. He just stayed. And Silas remembered every time he hadn't stayed. Every night he stood outside Rosalie's door and turned away. Every time his daughter cried and he called the nanny instead of coming himself. Every check he signed for specialists, as if money could replace presence. And the night he walked into his daughter's room and walked back out, closing the door too hard, disappearing into the dark hallway. He hadn't stayed. Not once. In the long silence, Helen added one more thing, her voice lower, as if she was deciding whether to say it, and then deciding that if she didn't say it now, she never would. "I know who you are, Mr. Ashford. I know what this house is. I know those black cars and men in suits aren't the staff of an ordinary company." Silas watched her, his eyes narrowing slightly, caution rising but not fully, because Helen's tone carried no threat and no judgment. "I was afraid," Helen continued. "The first day I walked in here I was afraid. I wondered if I was crazy for bringing my son into a place like this. But I stayed. Not for the money, though I need the money. I stayed because my son saw something in your daughter that made him brave. A 4-year-old who's scared of this house so much, his hand shakes around a piece of chalk every morning before he walks in. But he still walks in, for the girl upstairs. I can't take that away from either of them." The room was quiet. The desk lamp cast long shadows on the wall. The photograph of the wife he'd lost rested in its silver frame, her smile frozen in time. Silas looked at Helen for a long time. He didn't say thank you, not because he didn't want to, but because Silas Ashford had never said those 2 words to anyone in his life, and he didn't know where to begin. But he nodded, slow and deep, the kind of nod he saved for moments when words became unnecessary. Helen understood. She nodded back, gently, then turned and walked out into the hallway, the cleaning cloth still in her hand, her steps light and even on the new wood floor. Behind her, Silas remained in his study, staring at the silver photograph, and for the first time, his wife's promise didn't burn him. It was still there, still heavy, but beside it there was something else now. Not an answer, just a direction a woman holding a cleaning cloth had pointed him toward with 5 of the simplest words in the world. He just stayed. The peace lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks in which the house learned to breathe more softly, Rosalie learned to smile more often, and Silas learned how to stand outside his daughter's door without feeling like a threat. Those 3 weeks were almost long enough for him to forget that the world beyond the new hydraulic gate still ran by rules entirely different from the ones inside. Then Harris called at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. His voice was calm as always, but his pacing was a few percent faster, just enough for Silas to know this wasn't a routine update. The southern crew had moved, not the small probing on the outskirts Harris had reported earlier in the study. This time they took 3 consecutive sections along the main port line, cutting off one of Silas's most important transport routes. And what made Harris call at 6, instead of waiting for the regular meeting, was this. Last night, a black unmarked sedan sat outside the mansion gate for 40 minutes before driving away. No one got out. No action. It simply waited there, headlights off, engine running, then left. The message was clearer than any spoken threat. "We know where you live." Helen was the one who saw that car. She'd arrived earlier than usual because the day before Mrs. Pemberton asked her to prepare rooms for a new curtain installation. When Helen's old silver-gray car turned onto the drive toward the service gate, her headlights swept over the shape of a black sedan, parked tight to the curb across from the main gate. Helen wasn't the type to imagine things. She'd lived long enough in hard neighborhoods to know the difference between a car parked normally and a car parked on purpose. That car was on purpose. She drove straight into the courtyard, parked, and sat there for 3 minutes with both hands locked around the steering wheel. Jonah slept in the back seat, cradling his chalk box, peaceful. Helen looked at her son in the rearview mirror and felt fear rise from her stomach. Not fear for herself, but fear for the small creature in the back who trusted his mother completely to keep him safe. She found Silas in his study. He was behind the desk, phone just set down after Harris's call, his face wearing an expression Helen had never seen on him. Not the usual cold control, but tension, like a steel wire pulled close to snapping. Helen didn't knock. She walked straight in, and Silas looked up with a flicker of surprise, because no one but Harris ever entered this room uninvited. She didn't give him time to speak. A strange car was outside the gate this morning. If my son is put in danger because of who you are, I'll leave tonight. She didn't ask. She didn't beg. She didn't seek permission. She stated it in a steady, certain voice, the voice of a woman ready to lose her only income, ready to lose the place where her son had found purpose, ready to lose everything, if that was the price of keeping Jonah safe. Silas stared at Helen standing before his desk, spine straight, eyes fixed on his without blinking, hands held rigid at her sides, and in that moment he saw something that cut his breath short. Not Helen, the outline of someone else, the woman in the silver frame, lying on a hospital bed, face white, eyes burning, using her last breath not to say goodbye but to make him promise to protect their daughter. The willingness to trade everything for a child. The quiet ferocity of a mother when a boundary is touched. Helen didn't resemble his wife in any outward way. Different face, different build, different life, different world. But inside, at the deepest core of someone willing to burn everything so her child wouldn't be burned, they were so alike that Silas had to look away. He turned his gaze to the study window. Outside, in the early light, Jonah was sitting on the familiar stone step, and beside him, for the first time outside the house instead of behind the glass, Rosalie sat on the ground. The two children had their palms on the stone path, feeling something only they understood, and both of them were smiling. Silas looked at that image for 3 seconds, then looked back at Helen. "Give me until tonight." That was all he said. No explanation, no promise, just a short request from a man who wasn't used to asking anyone for anything. Helen held his gaze a long moment, then nodded once, turned, and walked out. That afternoon, Silas sat in a restaurant in downtown Hartford, the kind with a back corner table always kept empty for meetings that never appeared on reservation lists. Across from him sat Victor Salerno, leader of the Southern faction, a man around Silas's age but more than 20 kilograms heavier, with a salt and pepper beard and the eyes of a predator used to waiting for mistakes. Harris stood behind Silas near the wall, expression blank. 2 of Salerno's men stood behind him, also against the wall, also expressionless. 4 human walls surrounding 2 men facing each other across a small white tablecloth. Silas didn't waste time. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. Handwritten, brief. A warehouse section at the southern port. The piece of territory they'd been fighting over for almost a year, and control of 3 peripheral shipping routes. All of it would go to Salerno. In return, one condition. Silas's estate, a 2-mile radius around the mansion, would be outside every war from this point on. No car would come near. No man would appear. No message would be sent. That land would not exist on anyone's map. Salerno read the paper, read it again, then lifted his eyes to Silas with a look in which surprise outweighed greed, even though what Silas was offering to surrender was worth 10 times more than any deal Salerno had ever demanded. Silas Ashford didn't yield. For more than 10 years, the East Coast boss never offered negotiation, because negotiation implied equals, and Silas never treated anyone as his equal. Yet today he sat here and pushed part of his empire across the table, as if it were loose change, trading it for quiet around a stretch of land. "Why?" Salerno asked. Not because the answer mattered to the deal, but because survival in this world required understanding an opponent's motive before you shook his hand. Silas met Salerno's eyes. "Take it or don't, but that house disappears from the map. No explanation. No emotion. Not a single ripple on his face for Salerno to read. It was a pure transaction, delivered in the coldest voice Silas had, the voice everyone in this world knew and feared. Silas Ashford was still the boss. He still sat at the head of the table, still set terms instead of receiving them, still controlled the negotiation, even while he was the one yielding. Only the purpose had changed. Salerno stared at the paper 5 more seconds, folded it, slipped it into his inner jacket pocket, and nodded. Behind Silas, Harris watched the entire exchange, a negotiation that didn't last more than 4 minutes. And for the first time in more than 10 years following Silas Ashford, Harris Cole looked at his boss differently. He'd seen Silas negotiate hundreds of times, seen him crush rivals, expand territory, build an empire, but he'd never seen him surrender anything for anyone. Now, watching his boss stand, button his jacket, and walk out of the restaurant with the same decisive stride but a completely different direction, Harris understood the man in front of him wasn't only a boss. He was a father, and that was something Harris had never seen before. At 9 o'clock that night, Silas stood in the ground floor hallway when Helen came in through the service door, changed into clean clothes, hair still tied neatly back, her face carrying the look of a woman who'd already packed 2 suitcases in the car and was ready for an answer she didn't want to hear. Silas looked at her and said in the most ordinary voice he could manage, as if he were talking about the weather or tomorrow's work schedule, "No one touches this house, and no one touches your son. You have my word." Helen stared at him, not the quick glance and retreat she would have given any employer, but a long, steady look into his eyes, searching for something she needed to see before she could believe him. She wasn't looking for the assurance of Mafia power. She'd lived long enough to know every power had limits, and every promise could be broken. What she was looking for was simpler. She was looking for the father she'd glimpsed late at night beside the silver frame, the father the nanny had said stood outside his daughter's door through the storm, the father who today traded part of an empire for quiet for a 5-year-old child, and safety for a 4-year-old boy who wasn't even his blood. Helen saw that father standing there in his own hallway, eyes not cold the way she'd assumed, only forgotten how to warm, and slowly remembering. She nodded. She didn't say more. Silas didn't say more either. They stood in the quiet hallway, and the silence between them didn't need words, because it was already full. In the days after the negotiation with Salerno, Silas began doing something he'd never done before. He watched his daughter, not the kind of watching he'd done in the months before, peering through a crack in the door with heavy worry and then turning away when he couldn't bear it. Real watching, the kind where he sat in the second-floor sitting room with a cup of coffee, gone cold in his hand, and watched Rosalie play with Jonah without interfering, without judging, without hunting for signs of improvement or decline. He simply looked, and in the act of looking, a strange feeling he wasn't used to slowly formed, half gratitude and half shame, the two twisted together so tightly he couldn't separate them. Gratitude because his daughter was sitting on the floor with her palm resting on a thick book, feeling the vibration when Jonah tapped lightly on the cover, and there were no tears on her face. Shame because for 5 years he'd treated his daughter's pain the way he treated every other problem in his empire. Identify the problem. Find the solution. Spend money. Demand results. Refuse failure. He'd hired specialists the way he hired employees, measured progress the way he measured financial reports, and when results didn't appear, he poured in more resources as if his daughter were a failing business project that needed more capital. He'd never stopped to ask whether the problem was his approach, not his level of investment. And the answer, when it finally came, didn't come from a doctor or an expert or anyone he had to pay. It came from a 4-year-old boy sitting quietly on the floor. And from that boy's mother with 5 simple words Silas couldn't forget, no matter how hard he tried. He just stayed. That was all. And Silas, the man who could buy an entire building in an afternoon, who could command hundreds of people with a single phone call, who could force rivals to yield without raising his voice, had never managed to do the simplest thing in the world for his own daughter. He always left. Always closed the door. Always let the distance between himself and Rosalie grow after every failed attempt. Because Silas Ashford didn't know how to exist in a space where he couldn't control the outcome. But today was different. Today, after sitting long enough to understand he didn't need to control anything at all, Silas set the cold coffee down on the table and stood. Jonah had gone home with his mother half an hour earlier. Rosalie sat alone on the floor of the small sitting room, her back against the sofa leg, her hand resting on the book Jonah had left behind, her fingers tracing small, meaningless circles on the hard cover. Late afternoon sunlight came through the sound-insulating glass, softer and gentler than the old windows had ever allowed, laying pale gold across the wood floor and across the brown of her hair. Silas walked into the room. Slowly. Each step was conscious, not the decisive stride of a boss, but the careful steps of a man trying to learn how to move again inside his own home. He stopped 2 steps from Rosalie and did something he'd watched Jonah do dozens of times but had never done himself. He sat down on the floor, not in a chair looking down, not standing like a tower from above. He sat on the floor at his daughter's level, legs stretched out, back against the opposite sofa leg, about an arm's length from Rosalie. The new wood felt cool under his palm, and he sensed its firmness through the fabric of his trousers. Felt the difference from the soft leather chair in his study, where he'd sat for years looking down at the world. Here, on the floor, the world looked different. Lower, slower, closer. Rosalie looked up at her father. Her brown eyes, so like her mother's that every time Silas met them, it felt like someone drove a thin blade straight into the center of his chest. Studied him with cautious curiosity, not fear. She didn't recoil. She didn't curl away. There was nothing like the reaction of that night when he'd entered her room and been rejected by the most painful flinch of his life. She only looked, head slightly tilted, as if trying to understand why her father was sitting on the floor when she'd never seen him there before. Silas raised his right hand slowly. Very slowly. He'd learned by watching Jonah that around Rosalie, every movement had to be gentle and predictable. Nothing sudden, nothing hidden. He placed his palm on his own chest over his heart and tapped lightly. Once, twice, 3 times. A steady rhythm, like a heartbeat, like the way the 4-year-old had done it on the first day he sat beside Rosalie on this very floor. Rosalie watched her father's hand on his chest. Her eyes brightened, not much, but enough for Silas to see it, because she recognized the gesture. She knew what it meant. Heartbeat. Safe. I'm here. Then Silas extended his hand toward his daughter. Slowly, palm up, stopping in midair a short distance from her chest. And he waited. He waited the way Jonah had waited, the way Silas had never waited for anyone in his life, because Silas Ashford gave permission. He didn't ask for it. But this wasn't a boardroom or a negotiation. This was the floor beside his daughter, and here his power mattered less than patience. Rosalie looked at the hand hovering in front of her, looked up into his eyes, looked back at the hand, then, without needing the long hesitation she'd needed the first time with Jonah, she nodded. Silas placed his palm on his daughter's chest, gently. More gently than anything he'd ever done. His large, rough hand, the hand that had signed hundreds of orders and shaken hands with men the ordinary world didn't dare meet, now rested on the chest of a 5-year-old child with the care of someone touching the most precious thing he'd ever been allowed to hold. Under his palm, he felt his daughter's heartbeat. Small, fast, steady, alive. And Rosalie didn't pull away. She stayed still, feeling the warmth of his hand, feeling a gentle weight that this time carried no hurry and no power, only presence. Then she leaned into him. Her small head rested against Silas's arm, soft brown hair brushing his shirt sleeve, and her whole little body relaxed into him with a trust Silas didn't believe he deserved but received anyway. Silas's hand trembled. Not from cold or weakness, from feeling, from emotion, something his body had almost forgotten how to process after years of forcing it down. He sat there with his daughter against his arm, his hand on her chest, and understood that this was the first real conversation they'd ever had. No words, no need for words. Their language was heartbeat and warmth and presence, and it spoke more than any sentence Silas had ever delivered in any room on the East Coast. Then Rosalie lifted her head. She looked at him with clear brown eyes that hadn't carried tears for days, and slowly raised her small hand. That hand, tiny beside Silas's, fingers thin as new branches, rested on his chest over his heart. And she tapped. Once, twice, 3 times. A steady rhythm, a heartbeat. She was doing to him exactly what he'd just done to her, reversing it completely. For the first time since Jonah taught her the gesture, Rosalie wasn't only receiving, she was giving it back. Her small fingers tapped on Silas's chest, and each tap said something she didn't have words for. I can feel you too. I know you're here. I know your heart is beating, and I'm not afraid. Silas stared at the tiny hand on his chest, at those slender fingers tapping lightly through his shirt over the heart he'd believed for years had frozen solid. And for the first time in 41 years, Silas Ashford cried. Not loudly, not with sobs or shaking shoulders or anything dramatic, just tears, silent, sliding down from the corner of a man who'd never allowed himself to be weak in front of anyone. And this time he didn't hide them. He didn't turn away. He didn't wipe them off fast with the back of his hand. The tears fell, and he let them fall. Because in this room, on this floor, with his daughter in his arm, and her small hand tapping a heartbeat on his chest, he didn't have to be a boss. He only had to be her father. At the far end of the second-floor hall, Harris stood with his back against the wall. He'd come up to report a message from Salerno confirming the agreement was in effect. But when he saw the scene in the room through the open door, he stopped. He watched his boss sitting on the floor. He watched the child leaning into him. He watched the small hand on his boss's chest. He watched tears he'd never seen in more than 10 years at Silas Ashford's side. Harris turned away. His footsteps were light on the cushioned floor, almost creating no vibration at all. He went back down the stairs, Salerno's message still unspoken, and it could wait. Everything could wait. One late autumn morning, when the leaves across the estate began to shift from green to gold, and then to a fierce red, as if someone were coloring the world with enormous sticks of chalk, Rosalie Ashford stepped out of the house, not through the window she'd sat beside for so many months, but through the front door, on her own feet, with the stride of a child who was excited, not afraid. She went straight to the largest oak in the yard, the tree she'd only ever seen from behind glass, and placed both hands on the trunk. The bark was rough and warm beneath her palms, hotter where the sun struck it and cooler where shadow held it, and when the wind moved through the leaves above, the whole trunk gave a gentle tremor, a vibration nothing like the one from cars or iron gates. This one was alive, rhythmic, like the tree itself was breathing. Rosalie stood there a long time, arms around the trunk, eyes closed, head slightly tilted, and on her face was an expression that made Mrs. Pemberton, watching from the steps, turn her head away because her eyes burned. The look of a child hearing a song for the first time, even though Rosalie's ears had never heard any song at all. From the oak, Rosalie walked to the fountain in the center of the courtyard, the marble fountain she'd never touched because she'd never gone outside before. She dipped both hands into the water and her eyes widened. Water wasn't like any surface she'd ever felt. It moved, constantly. Every drop falling from the spout sent a small ripple outward, touching her fingers before traveling on, and Rosalie stood with her hands in the basin, feeling the current, as if she were reading a book written in a liquid language. Then she went to the brick wall, bordering the eastern garden, where the afternoon sun struck for hours, and she pressed her palm to the brick, hot, dry, and faintly alive with the smallest tremor when wind hit the wall and curled back. Each surface was a different voice, and Rosalie was walking through the world for the first time, not as a victim being attacked by it, but as an explorer learning her own private language. Jonah stayed beside her through that entire morning, the chalk box in his pocket as always. But something between the two children had changed in a way anyone could see. Jonah wasn't leading anymore. Rosalie was. She took his hand and pulled him to the tree, set his palm on the rough bark, and looked at him with an expression anyone could translate even without sign language. Feel it. The world is talking. Then she pulled him to the brick wall, pressed his hand to the warm surface, then to the fountain, dipped his hand into the cool, moving water. She had once been the child who curled beside a window, needing a 4-year-old boy to sit with her so she could understand that vibration wasn't a monster. Now she was the one sharing her world with that same boy, guiding him from surface to surface, texture to texture, through invisible voices only hands could hear. The roles had reversed completely, and the reversal was beautiful in a way no one in the house dared look at too long for fear of tears. Inside the house, Silas was changing too, but in the way of a man who understood actions more than feelings. He contacted Yale University not far from the estate, and funded a research program on sensory sensitivity in deaf children, a field the professors told him almost no one cared about because it was too narrow to attract federal funding. Silas wrote a check and said he didn't care about federal funding. He cared about results. Then he used the influence he still had in abundance, even after giving up part of his empire, to pressure 3 major construction projects in the region into conducting noise and vibration impact reviews before breaking ground, especially for projects near schools and hospitals. Harris handled most of those calls and meetings, and after a week of shuttling between law offices and city council rooms, he stood in the Hartford office and looked at Silas with one eyebrow raised. "You're getting soft." Silas didn't look up from the documents he was signing. "I'm waking up." Harris didn't add anything, but the corner of his mouth lifted for a 1/10 of a second before returning to the usual flat line, and it was probably the longest smile anyone had ever seen on Harris Cole's face. One evening, Silas called Helen into the ground floor living room. Helen came in still in her work clothes, her hands still faintly damp from dishwater, and stood in front of Silas with her usual caution. Silas stood by the window, staring out into the yard where darkness was settling, then turned back to her. "Your son changed my daughter. I want to give him the chance to change his own life." He spoke briefly, in the Silas way, no softening around the edges. A bedroom for Jonah in the mansion near Rosalie's room, so the boy wouldn't have to sleep in the backseat of the car during early mornings when his mother came to work. Books, any books he wanted. A private tutor, the best money could hire, to prepare him for the best school when he was old enough. Helen stood still for 3 seconds, then 4. Then her eyes turned red, and tears ran down her cheeks before she could stop them. Silent and fast, the way Rosalie's tears used to fall, but for the opposite reason. She couldn't say thank you right away because her throat tightened. She only lifted a hand to cover her mouth and nodded, nodding again and again. And Silas looked away, because he still wasn't used to seeing someone cry without feeling like he was the cause. Jonah stood at the living room doorway, where he'd quietly followed his mother out of curiosity to see why the boss had called her in. He stood there holding a worn-down piece of white chalk, powder dusting his fingers, the image of the boy who'd first stepped through the kitchen service door with only one purpose in his mind. He didn't understand everything Silas had said to his mother, but he understood his mother's tears, and he knew these were good tears. The next spring, Rosalie began attending a special school in New Haven. One Silas had interviewed 7 schools to find, not because they weren't qualified, but because the first 6 looked at Rosalie with pity, and Silas Ashford refused to let anyone pity his daughter. The 7th was different. They didn't pity. They didn't force. They taught Rosalie to understand herself, taught her that the way she experienced the world wasn't a defect. It was a language, and every language deserved to be learned, honored, shared. There, Rosalie found friends, children who also read the world with their hands, with vibration, with light, with everything except sound, and for the first time she understood she wasn't alone in the way she existed. Rosalie Ashford still didn't hear. She was still completely deaf in both ears, still living in a world without birdsong or rain or her father's voice. The world didn't change itself for her, but the way she touched it had changed completely. And that difference, small and quiet like Rosalie herself, was all that needed to change. Late afternoon. The last light of day slants across the estate, stretching the shadows of the oak trees into soft, dark ribbons over the green grass, and the air carries the unmistakable scent of a New England fall. Dry leaves, damp earth, the smell of a world preparing to rest before winter arrives. Rosalie sits on the lawn beside the stone path, legs stretched out in front of her, her dress spread around her like a small flower blooming on the ground. Beside her, Jonah lies on his stomach on the path, a stick of white chalk in his hand, drawing shapes on the stone just like the first day he sat on the back step of this house with a chipped tin chalk box and honey-colored eyes lifted toward the second-floor window, searching for a girl he'd never met. He's a little bigger now than he was then, taller, hair a bit longer. The chalk in his hand has been replaced by a new stick from the set Silas ordered for him, professional artist chalk that costs 50 times more than that old chipped box. But the way Jonah holds the chalk and draws is exactly the same, careful, unhurried, fully absorbed in his own world. Rosalie lays her palm on the grass. The short blades prick lightly at her skin, cool and slightly damp with evening dew, and beneath, through the soft soil, she feels the world living, a faint vibration from far away, maybe the footsteps of one of the guards patrolling the other side of the property. Light steps in soft-soled shoes, still enough for the ground to whisper back. Then another vibration, passing like a breath, the wind stirring the oak branches above and the whole trunk trembling gently, the motion traveling down through roots and spreading through the earth beneath her hand. And farther still, beyond the hydraulic gate, beyond the iron fence, beyond the property line, a car moves along the main road, sending a muted tremor almost too faint to notice. Yet Rosalie recognizes it because her hands have learned to read the world in the most delicate language. The world is still busy, still trembling, still moving without pause with millions of vibrations, big and small, every second. But it isn't frightening anymore. It's simply alive. And Rosalie is alive with it, her palm on the ground, eyes closed, lips curved in the small smile that has become familiar on her face now instead of tears. On the second-floor balcony, Silas stands looking down. Both hands rest on the stone railing, his eyes on the two children in the grass, and inside him is a feeling he didn't meet until 36 years into his life. Peace. Not peace because the empire is safe, because rivals have backed off, because money still flows, because no one dares to challenge him. Not the peace of power. The peace of a father watching his daughter smile in the late light, her hand on the earth, sensing the world not with ears but with her whole body, and knowing she isn't afraid. The promise to his wife, the promise that burned him through so many nights in his study before the silver frame, for the first time, isn't a fire. It's still there, still warm, but now it feels more like a candle than a blaze. Harris stands beside Silas on the balcony, half a step away, hands in his pockets, face still unreadable as always. But today he isn't holding a phone. There's no folder in his hand, no report or message or problem waiting to be handled. For the first time in more than 10 years at Silas Ashford's side, Harris Cole stands next to his boss with nothing to deliver. He simply stands there. Two men watching two children in the grass, and neither of them speaks because there's nothing that needs to be said. Below them, Rosalie opens her eyes and takes Jonah's hand. She guides his hand down to the grass beside her own, and the two of them feel the ground beneath their palms together. Jonah smiles. Rosalie smiles. The late sun lays a warm gold over the two children, and their shadows join on the grass into a single shape. If someone asked Silas Ashford what the most important moment of his life was, he wouldn't mention his first deal or his biggest contract. He would say, "One day, a boy with a piece of chalk in his hand taught my daughter not to fear this world, and taught me how to truly listen." This story is a reminder that sometimes the smallest hands carry the greatest truth, that listening doesn't always require ears. It requires a heart willing to stay. That real strength isn't controlling the world around you. It's understanding the world inside the people you love, and that sometimes the answers to the most complicated questions are so simple only a child can see them. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. How did this story make you feel? What did it bring up from your own life? Have you ever realized that someone beside you didn't need advice, didn't need solutions? They only needed you to stay. We'd truly love to hear what you feel deep in your heart, so please leave a comment below so we can share and connect together. If you enjoy stories like this, please subscribe to our channel, tap like, and share the video so that every day you can listen to meaningful stories that remind us what truly matters in life. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Thank you for staying with us to the end. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.